Welcome back to another episode of Sorry for Rambling. As always, I'm Alex Kack, and I'm joined today by Mark Charles. He's a candidate for the United States presidency. Mark, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much, Alex. If I could, I'd like to take a moment just to introduce myself.
Absolutely.
Yat Mark Charles Yunishya. Sin Bakedina Nisla, the Tohiglini Basis Chin, Sin Bakedina Dasachado Todochini Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our four clans. We're matrilineal as a people with our identities coming from our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsinbeke. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbeke. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Todochitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also just want to acknowledge I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C. today, and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. This is a nation that they've lived here, they've hunted here, they farmed here, they fished here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And I am humbled and honored to be living in the land stewarded by the Piscataway. I want to acknowledge that they are still here, and I want to honor them as the host people of these lands.
Wonderful. Honestly, I didn't know that about the four clans in the Navajo culture, and that is a really beautiful way, I feel like, to pay tribute to family. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, it's very important for your identity. One way I describe it is if you ask most Americans, especially European Americans, who they are, they'll tell you their occupation. I'm a plumber, I'm a farmer, I'm a teacher, I'm a scientist, I'm unemployed. If you ask most Navajos who you are, we're going to tell you who our relations are, who we're related to, who our relatives are, who our family is. Two very different ways of kind of identifying ourselves.
It is, and it's a really, really important, I think, distinction. I think there is a tendency, especially in white American culture, but really in American culture broadly in the modern age, to identify with one's occupation and to create your identity entirely around the occupation. That can be incredibly detrimental.
Well, it also really helps. It defines a lot of our politics. So when you look at one of the biggest political issues of our past decade, which has been immigration reform, the biggest challenge or the biggest concern people have over immigrants is what? They're stealing our jobs. For a nation that identifies itself occupationally, that's a primary concern. And the biggest concern is, okay, once they're here, how do we get them into the workforce? That's the biggest concern. One of the things I'm been saying throughout my candidacy is that I truly believe that Native peoples need to have a space at the table. If we're ever going to truly comprehensively and justly reform immigration law, Native peoples have to be at the table. And to have a group of people there who identify themselves not occupationally but relationally will actually change the paradigm, I think, on how we even discuss immigration reform and some of the highest priorities we have of what does it mean to welcome or to incorporate immigrants into our society. What if we looked at it not just from an occupational standpoint, but actually from a relational standpoint?
I think that's an incredibly valid point. It is interesting the way I think that the kind of cultural identity that we develop, how significantly that plays into political leanings and how much that those political leanings become, political identity. They become, that's almost the next category. It'd be before family or before religion, I'm a plumber, I'm a Republican, people really tend to lead almost from their chest with it. To me, these are things that I feel like lack a lot of heart, frankly, though. They lack a lot of human connection. Politics seems, especially in a democracy, like it should be based on human connection. And yet when it comes into that kind of mindset where it's I'm this group, you're that group, it seems like it's such a way to just separate people even further from one another.
Yeah. The hyper partisanship of the past, not just decade, really the past 4 or 5 decades in our nation. I see a lot of that in play. The reason we have the hyper-partisanship is because of the ongoing dialogue and the the changes we've had even in our nation racially. So when people talk about, well, 50, 60 years ago, our Congress members used to be able to reach across the aisle and compromise a whole lot more, and there was a lot more bipartisanship in the House and in the Senate. And when I don't deny that's not true. That is very true. But also 50, 60 years ago, Congress was almost exclusively a white landowning male club. And that pretty much agreed on the issues of white supremacy, racism, and sexism. And so they were able to have a much more nuanced debate on their policies because they all agreed on who was in the room and who was making the decisions. As our Congress has gotten more diverse, it's actually increased the partisanship because one of the things now is you have different people at the table who are making decisions who have very different experiences and memories of the history that we're talking about as a nation. And so one of the things I point out, and often when I talk policy, so often policy, especially over the past few decades, has turned into a checklist. We don't have discourse on policy. We don't debate policy. We have a checklist. We have a bingo card, and you fill out your card, and your candidate fills out their card, and you see who matches up, and then you love them or you hate them, but either way, you don't have to listen to them anymore. And what we're trying to do with policy is, rather than just creating a checklist, here's where I stand on this and that, I'm trying to reframe our policy discussion. I would argue that our nation has never been able to have political policy debate with diverse voices at the table. We've never learned how to do it. And because our nation started with only white landowning men at the table, as the diversity has grown, we've never learned how to do it. And so what we have now is we have people get elected based on their bingo card and who will vote for them and put them in office. And then their job, because we're so hyper-partisan, is to basically drive their policies down the throat of the opposing party. So President Obama drove healthcare down the throat of the Republicans. Donald Trump drove his wall down the throat of the Democrats. And so if you get elected into office based on this bingo card, the only way you can govern is by executive order or by actually completely pissing off your opponent, your political opponents, because there's no more discourse. There's no discourse. And so what we're trying to do in our campaign is, rather than giving people a bingo card to fill out, we're actually trying to reframe all of the policy debates and saying, these are the types of discussions we want to have, actually teaching how to have these types of discussions politically, so that if I get into office, I actually might be able to govern rather than just try and rule, which is what we've had for the past 3 or 4 decades.
You're running as an independent, correct? You're not running under
Yes.
the lens of another party. Do you find that helps, not having a stated kind of party allegiance, that helps you to be able to try to steer those types of more nuanced conversations?
Absolutely. Independents are the second largest registered voters in the U.S. The Democrats have the highest group. Republicans used to be second, but now independents actually outnumber Republicans. And so, yeah, there's a lot of independents out there, people who are very frustrated with the deep partisanship and the inability of our parties to communicate. And so when you run as an independent, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because you're able to have much more nuanced conversations and much more nuanced discussion. The challenge is media, the political system don't listen to you. Like, we are so conditioned to this two-party system that to run outside of that party, people actually say, well, they don't take you seriously as a candidate. And what I've tried to convince people of over the past 14, 15 months since I announced in May of 2019, is the reason I'm running as an independent is because I actually want to be president. Had I run as a Democrat, I would have raised more money. I could have been in the debates, but I never would have been nominated, right? All the people of color were removed from the stage while the Democrats were changing the rules to keep people like Michael Bloomberg on the stage. Like, there's no way I would have, all the people of color were removed from the debate stage even before the first primary. And so, yes, I could have run a good protest campaign as a Democrat, but I would have never been nominated. running as an independent, I'm going to raise less money. I won't be on the debate stage. I'll have a smaller platform, but I actually will have an opportunity to run in the general election, which is what I'm doing right now. So I've had to convince people that I'm running as an independent, not because I'm a protest candidate, but because I refuse to be a protest candidate.
Did you used to have a party registration or allegiance? Do you have a preference between the two major parties?
I was raised in a more conservative upbringing, so I was probably raised in a more Republican family. My first election, I think I voted for Ross Perot back in '92, and I probably identified more as a Democrat for a number of years, but I've never been fully sold. Like, I would never have called myself a Republican. I definitely would have not called I'm not even sure why I voted for Perot now. I have to remember back. And with, since then, you know, as I've, especially in the past 15, 20 years, where I've been really engaged with social justice issues and living on the Navajo Nation with my people, and really listening very closely to politicians from both sides of the aisle, I've never really felt a strong allegiance to either party. And so when I registered maybe 3 or 4 years ago as an independent, it actually felt very, very freeing to me. It felt like, yeah, this is where I am. I'm not, I've always said, you know, I'm either I don't fit well into either the Republican or the Democratic boxes. And so registering as independent felt very much more at home for me.
You know, that touches on a couple of different points that I feel like are important, which is one, kind of your background. I mean, you've been a somewhat prominent activist and writer for some time. Tell me, I mean, what were the issues that you really cared about, and how your kind of path as an activist developed?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's grown over the years. It started really when I moved. Well, one of the bigger turning points is when I moved from Denver, Colorado, where I was pastoring a church, to the Navajo Nation. And I wanted to experience firsthand life on the reservation, the way my grandparents, even my father, grew up. I had been raised in a border town. I never had lived on the reservation. And we wanted to live there. We moved into a very traditional setting. We were on a sheep camp in Hogan, a small one-room dwelling, dirt floor, log walls. We were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. The community we lived in had no running water, no electricity. And we were there. A good portion of the Navajo Nation lives that way. Maybe 30% of our people live that way today. And so I really wanted to experience that lifestyle. So when we moved there, we were prepared to live off the grid, right? We were prepared to haul our water and cook by campfire or over a camp stove. We were prepared to use an outhouse and you know, live by candlelight and so on. But what we weren't prepared for was how deeply marginalized the reservation was. It literally felt like we dropped off the face of the earth. And quickly learned that living on the Indian reservation, the primary groups of non-natives that you ever see are either those who come to give you charity or those who come to take your picture. Almost no one comes just to get to know you as a person. While I was there, I was experiencing the historical trauma of our people coming from the boarding schools and the removal and the genocidal history our country enacted. I was learning about this thing called the doctrine of discovery. And I was finding myself becoming increasingly angry. And I was trying to process through my emotions. And I was talking with some of my friends on the phone. These are friends I've had from college and previously, and trying to sort through what I was feeling. And every time the issues would come up, I could feel my emotions kind of rising in me. And soon I'd have to hang up the phone or change the subject because I could feel my emotions getting the better of me. So I learned how to kind of disconnect emotionally. I would talk about these things like I was something I read in the newspaper. Then I could stay in the conversation longer, but it wasn't long until my friends would hang up the phone. Well, it wasn't my people who did that to you. It wasn't my family that did those things. And they would be very frustrated. And I couldn't figure out how to have the dialogue I knew I wanted to have. One day I was writing a letter, maybe the 10th time, trying to figure out how to articulate this to my friends, my non-Native friends. In my letter, I said, being Native American and living on an Indian reservation in the middle of this country, the United States, it feels like our native community is this old grandmother who has a very large and very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to the bedroom, but it's much later, and we're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts the most, the thing that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, "Thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house." I wrote that, I'm like, that's it. That's what I'm feeling. I started sharing that. People on the reservation would come up to me and they'd say, you know, I've lived here for a long time. I've struggled to articulate how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I'd share that with non-natives, and they'd come up to me. Instead of getting defensive, they'd come back and say, how do we say thank you? How does my family, my community, my church, my city, my nation express gratitude to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island? Now we're having a very different conversation. Now, instead of talking about victim versus oppressor, now we're talking about what I think is the crux of the matter, which is this reversal of roles, where we have 300 million plus undocumented immigrants, mostly Europeans coming from across the Atlantic, running around, acting like they own the place. They've never asked for permission, nor have they been given permission to be here, but they act like they own the place. We have 6 million Native peoples living like unwanted guests in someone else's house. We have a reversal of roles. The guests are acting like the hosts, and the hosts are acting like the guests. And I'm working very hard to reframe that discussion so we can actually begin to reverse the roles. And that is what kind of began the process for me of the work I'm doing today, which is how do we have these types of discussions? How do we reframe the dialogue so we actually can find a way to talk about it? How do we look at it from a different angle, different perspective, so that we can get down to what I would say is the heart of the matter and maybe make some systemic and foundational level changes?
It's a really eye-opening way that you described that, actually. I think it's an easy point to kind of pivot to policy. You're talking about having those nuanced discussions, and obviously, I mean, that's a great way to frame a discussion. But what are some policies that could be enacted, or that maybe your administration would pursue, specifically when we're talking about indigenous peoples or life on the reservation? How can the nation best address some of these needs?
Yeah, I mean, we could go on for hours about these things. I'll just give you one very short glimpse. There's a crisis in Indian country. It's known as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Literally hundreds, thousands of Indigenous women and girls have been reported missing by their families or reported murdered by their families to law enforcement. Their families reported them. And not only have most of their cases never been closed, but in many instances, they've never been opened. Law enforcement at the local, state, and federal level just completely ignore these requests. And oftentimes it's left to the families to go out and to find their daughters and their wives and their children themselves. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I actually wear my hair, my Navajo bun, my CA, and it's tied with red yarn to remind myself of this crisis in Indian country. Last August, I was at the Frank Lemire Native American Presidential Forum. I was there with Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Julian Castro. 10 of the top Democrats were at this forum. I was also there as an independent. One of the questions they asked at the forum was the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And almost all the candidates, once learning about this crisis, came back and said, well, I would propose this kind of law or this sort of policy to protect this very vulnerable demographic. What I tell people is when your Declaration of Independence refers to natives as savages, because if you read the Declaration of Independence, 30 lines after the statement all men are created equal, it actually refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. The Constitution, which starts with the words, "we the people," Article 1, Section 2, which defines who is and who is not a part of the Constitution, who's protected by this document, it never mentions women. In fact, if you read the Constitution from the preamble to the 27th Amendment, you will see that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. Not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. The state of Virginia ratified the ERA earlier this year. But because that ERA had been kind of grandfathered out, or had been the timing on it had closed, it didn't get ratified. So it's 2020, and we can't even decide, do we want to constitutionally treat women as equal? So I tell people, when your Declaration of Independence calls natives savages, and your Constitution never mentions women, you shouldn't be surprised when your indigenous women go missing and get murdered, and society doesn't care. A new law isn't going to fix this problem. The problem is the basis for our laws. If our Declaration of Independence is our statement of values, and our Constitution is the literal basis for our law, and those are the documents that say natives are savages and women aren't included, if we want to address this problem, we have to address the foundations. And so this is where I'm almost all of my policies, I'm bringing it down to the foundations. In my first 100 days, I actually laid out my policy, my plan for my first 100 days in office. And my goal is to remove the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy from our foundations. I have on my website, under my blog link, I have a draft of the Constitution. I read the Constitution beginning to end 4 or 5 years ago. I was so disgusted by what I saw, I put it onto my computer and used a strike-through font. I didn't change balance of powers. I didn't change checks and balances. I simply put a strike-through font through the racist, the sexist, and the white supremacist language. And my proposal is, after inauguration, I will submit that draft to the Senate and ask Mitch McConnell to have this voted on and approved as amendments to the Constitution, and then sent out to be ratified by the states. Again, I'm basically making the Constitution say what most people think it says anyway. Most people don't know how racist and sexist and white supremacist our Constitution is. So I'm really taking out the things that most people don't even know are there. And if we do that, it's not going to change things overnight, but it's going to give us the basis for our laws that actually allow us to have a nation where we the people includes everybody. Because right now it doesn't.
I mean, it's an incredibly good point. You know, you talk about you use the word foundation, and you think of a building or a structure that has a rotted foundation. It isn't going to stand for long.
Yeah.
Now, I understand that we have to let you go relatively soon. I believe you said you had another interview after this. But I wanted to ask, and this is another broad, open-ended question, so I'm sorry to try to shoehorn this in here right as you have to leave. But why should voters who are there's many voters in this country who, they may not see themselves represented in Joe Biden, yet they are so fearful of Donald Trump. Why would you say that they should vote for you instead of either of those two?
When you look at the two-party system, the goal of the two-party system is to maintain the status quo. I gave a TEDx talk about 2.5 years ago. It's titled "We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in U.S. history." In this TED Talk, I go through 2 very crucial Supreme Court cases. One was Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. The other was the city of Sherrill versus the Oneida Indian Nation of New York in 2005. In 1823, there were 2 men of European descent litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case goes to the Supreme Court. The court had to decide the principle that land titles were based on. Who had the right to sell the land, the tribe or the government? They ruled that discovery is what gives title to the land. And then they reference the doctrine of discovery, which I've written about in my book, Unsettling Truth. And in using that doctrine, they stated that because natives are savages, we are mere occupants of the land, whereas white Europeans who are fully human have the fee title to the land, or have discovery to the land, so they are the true title holders. That case in 1823, along with a few others, create the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the doctrine of discovery get referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. I go through in that TEDx talk very closely through that 2005 case, helping people understand how that is one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court cases written in my lifetime. And that opinion was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, she is the voice of dissent on the left in a very conservative-leaning Supreme Court. She's the person fighting for the marginalized. We're seeing her legacy being built before our eyes right now. And she didn't just side with the conservatives, she wrote the opinion. Why? Because when land titles are based on this dehumanizing doctrine of discovery, white supremacy becomes a bipartisan value. So this is the challenge we face as a nation, is our foundations are not crumbling, they're bad. They are very exclusive, they are racist, they are sexist, they are white supremacists, and they're actually working quite well. When you look at what's happened with George Floyd, you look what's happened with all these things that are going on right now, this is because of our foundations. And so the two-party system is meant to maintain that status quo. And I actually I spent a lot of time, I will absolutely agree, Donald Trump is a disaster as a president and is wreaking havoc in our nation. I will not disagree with that. He is. He's causing a lot of headaches. But Joe Biden and the Democrats are merely just an implicit understanding of that same, how can I describe this? Let's go back to 2016, okay? Donald Trump was running, and his campaign was to make America great again. Hillary Clinton, not to be outdone, told her supporters that America's great already. In fact, during the debates, the general election debate, she expanded on that and said, not only is America great already, but America's great because America is good. And Donald Trump stopped. He looked at her and he said, I agree with her. I agree with everything she just said. At the Democratic National Convention, President Obama jumped into the fray and said, America's already pretty great. Cory Booker, African-American senator from New Jersey. He was a rising star in the Democratic Party. He ran for president this past year. In his speech endorsing Hillary Clinton, he acknowledges that the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as savages. He acknowledges that the Constitution excludes women, and he acknowledges the Three-Fifths Compromise. All of this is groundbreaking. Most people at his level do not acknowledge any of these flaws in our foundation. He acknowledges all three. But he ends that section of the speech by telling the white landowning men of the Democratic Party that these things do not detract from America's greatness. See, we thought, so if we have Donald Trump saying, make America great again, and Hillary Clinton saying America's great already, then they both agree our past, our history, our foundations are great. They disagreed if we were great in 2016. Donald said no, Hillary said yes. We thought the 2016 election was about racism versus anti-racism, or equality versus inequality. It wasn't. What we were debating as a nation was, do we want Donald Trump to make us explicitly white supremacist, racist, and sexist again? Or do we want Hillary Clinton to work to keep our white supremacy, racism, and sexism implicit? We voted in the popular vote for implicit, and the Electoral College gave us explicit. So this is the challenge. So both systems are about maintaining the status quo and keeping our foundations intact. Even right now, during this debate on race, right? We've had a debate on policing. We've had a debate on criminal justice reform. We've had a debate on Confederate monuments. Donald Trump said, let's keep our monuments in place. Joe Biden said, let's put them in the museum. Donald Trump said, let's ban some chokeholds. Joe Biden said, let's shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. Donald Trump said, let's keep honoring George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who owned enslaved people. And Joe Biden said, I agree. I'm the only candidate who said, why don't we start our criminal justice reform by abolishing slavery? The 13th Amendment, if you read it, doesn't actually abolish slavery. It keeps it legal in the criminal justice system. It says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereas the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. We've never abolished slavery. We've redefined and codified it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. Neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden have any interest in dealing with that systemic problem. They can talk about chokeholds, they can talk about where to shoot people, they can talk about where to put Confederate monuments. They are not willing to talk about the foundations. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg references the dehumanizing doctrine of discovery and essentially calls native savages to keep land titles in place in 2005. So this is where we have to understand the two-party system is never going to give the people on the margins, people of color, African Americans, Native Americans, women, members of LGBTQIA2S+. They're never going to give that equality to those groups. They're going to work to keep the foundations in place and just keep pushing, kicking the can down the road. We'll get equality later. We'll get there later. We'll get there later. We'll get there later, rather than actually addressing those needs now. And so what I tell people is, when you have a house that has a bad foundation, you got cracks in your window sills, you got a crooked floor, you have plaster broken in your walls, you can scream and debate all you want about what color paint to paint the walls, what kind of caulking to put on your windows, what kind of carpet to put on the floor, but you have to fix the foundations. And people are saying, well, but yes, but the house is actually on fire right now and we have to put that out. I'm like, what better time to fix your foundations than when the house is literally falling down, right? There's never a convenient time to fix your foundations. Never. So actually, when the house is falling down is not a bad time to say, okay, let's, rather than remodeling the kitchen, let's actually fix the foundations right now. And so this is where our campaign, and to this day, we have on our website, we have a 9-minute announcement video. We released it last May of 2019. I get emails regularly from people who've learned about our campaign, and they will email me and they say, Mr. Charles, I'm literally in tears. I just saw your announcement video and it's given me hope. Right now we have two candidates. The Republicans are putting forth one of the most divisive candidates we've seen in generations. And the Democrats are putting forward one of the most uninspiring candidates we've seen in generations. And they're both saying one of these two people can fix our problems. And I'm running as an indigenous man, as an independent, with a vision of actually not just saying I'm not Trump or I'm not Biden, but saying I have a vision for building a nation where for the very first time, we the people might actually mean all the people. And this is the hope that people see and they hear. And if we can get them to think outside of this two-party system and actually see the more expanded view of what needs to happen and what we're trying to do, these are the kind of things that could turn our campaign around in a day, in an instant, if we can just break through that hopelessness that comes from the two-party system.
Thank you so much. Again, that's Mark Charles, independent candidate for President of the United States. Mark, thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. People can learn more about our campaign on our website, which is markcharles2020.com. I really appreciate talking with you today, Alex. I'd love to come back when we have more time. I'd love to have some more discussion with you if you'd like to do that.
I'd love to have you. Thank you again. Please stay safe out there.
All right. Take care. Have a good day.